Hi, friends. It's good to be with you again. My name is John Jeffrey. I'm a Bible teacher and a clinical psychologist. As a clinical psychologist, one of the most common questions I've had, one of the greatest struggles that people have, they'll ask a question like, what is the biblical way to know who you are? And I'll say, well, tell me what you mean. Well, it's like when things don't go well, I get discouraged and I feel bad about myself. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. When I get discouraged, I start feeling bad about myself. So what's the biblical way to get to know yourself so I don't feel bad about myself so often? Jesus was asked a question that goes very much to the heart of this issue. He was asked by a lawyer who was aware of the 613 commandments in the Old Testament, and he asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? This is Matthew 22, verse 36 through 40. Jesus answered, the greatest commandment, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind. In the book of Mark, he adds all of your strength. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus was saying these two things, if you will do these two things, everything will be defined in the right way. Well, how does that relate to the question we're talking about? What's the biblical way of getting to know who you are? What's the biblical way of defining who you are? We've got to start with how Jesus said was the greatest way of defining God and defining our relationship to him by loving God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, and all of our strength. And second, to love our neighbor as ourselves. If we'll do those two things, God will supernaturally help us to manage everything else. And everything else will flow in a way beyond any human capability, including your sense of who you are. Well, now, Doc, are you telling me that you cannot get to know your true self apart from doing those two top commandments? That's exactly what I'm saying. Life is not going to work right. You're not functioning and operating according to the way God designed you. Believing the faithful fathers of believing Jews, now we're talking about all the prophets of the Old Testament, the faithful fathers, every believing Jew was required to say this greatest commandment in the Old Testament. It's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. Believing Jews were required to say this, to proclaim it twice a day. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind. As Tevye says in Fiddler on the Roof, because of this, every one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Now, that's true of the prophets in the Old Testament, Jeremiah and Daniel and Elijah and Elisha and Micah and Amos and all the others. It's the same great commandment. We have to get oriented, defined in our relationship with God. Define ourselves who we are in our relationship with God. It has to start with the knowledge of God, loving God, and then we get to know ourselves and we can get to know others in the proper way. In terms of defining our relationship with God, the greatest commandment in the New Testament is Matthew chapter 22, verse 36 through 40. We're talking about defining our relationship with God. Earlier in Matthew 22, God reveals a mystery which John the Baptist had talked about, the mystery, Matthew 22, verse 1 through 14, that God the Father is arranging a marriage for his Son. Jesus the Son is the spiritual bridegroom. God's people are the spiritual bride. It's a spiritual relationship. But this defines who we are. It defines who God is, it defines who we are, and it defines how God loves us. This is a spiritual husband and wife relationship, a spiritual relationship. But when you have the best of men as the husband, the wife can trust him and she can trust his love. She can receive the depth, the devotion, his wholehearted loyalty, and she can love him back in that way. Misty Edwards has a chorus in one of her songs based on the greatest commandment and based on the marriage feast teaching where the father's arranging a marriage for his son, Jesus. She has a chorus that perfectly, it is theologically sound in every way. This is the chorus. It defines who you are. I'm in love with God. God's in love with me. That is who I am. That is who I'll be. That settles it completely. I'm in love with God. God's in love with me. That is who I am. That is who I'll be. That settles it completely. I had a young man recently ask me, we were talking about these very things, and he said, Doc, tell me, during this struggle where I'm trying to grow in these things, why do you have so much peace and I don't have the peace that you have? I said, my friend, that is such a great question. Listen to this answer and believe it. The only difference between the peace I have and the peace that you don't have is I'm doing a better job of being aware that apart from Christ, I'm not going to have that peace. Apart from Christ, I'm not going to do my best to love him with my whole heart and to love my neighbor as myself. I'm going to slip into just comfort and security, and I'm going to slip away. I'm doing a better job than you of recognizing my weakness, that I need God so much, and I'm doing a better job of depending on God. Doc, you mean to tell me that's the only difference? Well, now, wait a minute. I said, based on your question was, what's the difference between my peace and your peace? You're going to have the same peace I have when you will realize you're in great need of God to feel good about yourself. And you'll depend upon God to do your best. None of us are doing it perfectly. Do our best to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Do your best. This is it. Do your best. Don't give up. Keep at it. Stay on the path. Stay on the proven path. Do your best to love God with your whole heart, your neighbor as yourself. Do your best. Don't give up. Keep at it. I'm in love with God. God's in love with me. That is who I am. That is who I'll be. That settles it completely. And like Tevye, every one of us can know who he is and what God expects us to do. Bye, friends. We'll see you next time. I love you.